There is a thought in your mind right now that you believe is yours. A judgment, a worry, a desire. You assume it came from you, that it belongs to you. But what if it doesn't? What if the voice you've been listening to your entire life is not your voice at all? Not in a metaphorical sense, not as poetry, but as a structure, as something that was placed there so long ago you forgot it wasn't native. You've been taught to call this voice reason, logic, your personality. But when you trace it back, when you really examine where these thoughts come from, you find something disturbing. They don't arise from silence. They arise from repetition, from loops you didn't design, from fears you never chose. And beneath those thoughts, if you listen closely, there is a tone, a frequency, a kind of pressure that feels almost external, even though it's seated deep inside your mind. The ancient Gnostics had a word for this. They called it the Archon, not a demon in the clouds, not a literal entity, but a pattern, a parasite of perception, a structure that feeds on your attention and makes you believe its voice is your own. You've felt this before. In the middle of the night, when a thought circles endlessly, even though you want it to stop. In moments of decision, when you feel split, as if two forces are pulling you in opposite directions. In the repetition of behaviors you swore you'd never repeat. The Archon doesn't announce itself. It hides in familiarity. It speaks in your tone. It uses your memories. And because it has been there so long, you defend it as if it were you. But here is the unsettling part. What if you could hear the difference? Most people go through life never questioning the origin of their thoughts. A thought appears, and they believe it. An emotion surfaces, and they justify it. A compulsion arises, and they follow it. This seems natural. Thoughts are supposed to be personal. But if you slow down and observe, you notice something strange. Thoughts repeat. Not just similar thoughts. The exact same sequence. The same internal argument. The same self-criticism. The same fantasy. Over and over as if on a loop. And when you try to stop them, they don't stop. They continue. Sometimes louder, as if they have momentum independent of your will. This is the first clue. The Archon operates through repetition. It doesn't need to be creative. It only needs to be persistent. And persistence over time becomes identity. Think about your default emotional state, the mood you return to when nothing external is happening. For some, it's anxiety. For others, restlessness. For many, a low hum of dissatisfaction. You might call this your baseline, but why is there a baseline at all? Why does your mind, in the absence of stimuli, produce discomfort? A clear mind would rest in neutrality, in silence. But your mind doesn't. It generates, it churns, it keeps you occupied. And the content it generates is almost always the same. The same doubts, the same judgments, the same fears dressed in different scenarios. This is not random. This is structure. And the structure has a purpose. It keeps you identified. It keeps you reacting. It keeps you inside a loop where you never stop long enough to notice the loop itself. What if this inner voice, the one you've trusted your whole life, was designed not to free you, but to keep you circling? The Archon doesn't control you through force. It controls you through identification. It makes you believe that you are your thoughts, that you are your emotional reactions, that you are the story you've been telling about yourself since childhood. And because you believe this, you defend it, you protect it, you feed it with attention. But here's the deeper pattern. The Archon convinces you that if you lose this identity, you lose yourself. That if you stop the inner dialogue, you'll disappear. This is the core mechanism. Fear of silence, fear of stillness, fear of the space beneath the noise. So you keep the noise going. You fill every moment with distraction, stimulation, internal chatter, not because you want to, but because stopping feels like death. This isn't metaphor. This is how the system operates. The moment you sit still, the moment you close your eyes and try to rest in awareness, the thoughts intensify, they flood in. Urgent, demanding. They pull you back into identification, and you follow. Because you've been conditioned to believe that thinking is living, that to stop thinking is to stop existing. But the Gnostics understood something crucial. The self that fears silence is not your true self. It's the construct. It's the overlay. It's the Archon wearing your face, your real self. The awareness beneath the thoughts has no fear of stillness. It doesn't need constant stimulation. It doesn't need to narrate. It simply is. But the Archon can't survive in that space. So it keeps you moving, it keeps you identified, it keeps you afraid of the very silence that would reveal its presence. And here's the question you'll eventually have to face. If you are not the voice in your head, then who is speaking? One of the Archon's most effective tools is rationalization. You feel an impulse, and immediately your mind constructs a reason. You feel anger, and your mind finds a target. You feel lack, and your mind builds a story of why you don't have enough. This happens so quickly you never notice the gap between the impulse and the justification. That gap is where the Archon operates. It feeds you the impulse, then feeds you the reason, and you experience both as a unified thought process, as your own conclusion. But if you slow it down, if you observe carefully, you see the machinery. The impulse comes first, the emotion comes first, the reaction comes first, and only afterward does the mind scramble to explain why it felt right to react that way. This is how the loop sustains itself. You never question the origin because you're too busy justifying the outcome. You never ask why the anger appeared. You only ask who deserves the anger. You never ask why the craving arose. You only ask how to satisfy it. The Archon keeps you focused on content, never on structure. On the specifics of the thought, never on the fact that the thought is repetitive. On the story, never on the fact that the story is a loop. And because you're always inside the content, you never step back far enough to see the pattern. The pattern is this: react, justify, repeat. React, justify, repeat. Over and over, across years, across lifetimes, the same core programs running beneath different costumes. Different names, different faces, but the same structure. And the most disturbing part? The more you justify, the more real it becomes. The more you defend your reactions, the more they solidify into identity, until you can't tell the difference anymore between what you are and what you've been programmed to believe you are. What if everything you think you chose was actually a response to a pattern you never saw? The Archon doesn't just operate internally. It projects outward. It makes you see the world through a distorted lens, and then convinces you that the distortion is reality. This is why people can look at the same situation and see completely different things. Not because reality is subjective, but because each person is looking through a different filter. A filter built from past wounds, unprocessed emotions, inherited beliefs. The Archon uses this filter to keep you reactive. It shows you a trigger, and you respond, not to what's actually there, but to what the filter interprets. And because the filter is invisible to you, you believe you're responding to reality. You believe your anger is justified. Your fear is reasonable. Your judgment is accurate. But you're not responding to the present, you're responding to a projection of the past. This is why the same arguments repeat in relationships, why the same problems resurface in different contexts, why you keep meeting the same type of person, wearing a different face. The outer circumstances change, but the inner pattern remains, and the inner pattern is the Archon. It doesn't want resolution, it wants repetition, it wants you to keep reacting, keep engaging, keep feeding the loop with your emotional energy, because every time you react, you reinforce the pattern. Every time you project, you make the filter more solid, and the more solid the filter becomes, the less you're able to see what's actually in front of you. You see through the Archon's eyes, you interpret through the Archon's logic, and you believe it's your own perception. The Gnostics called this the veil, not a literal veil, but a perceptual one, a layer of distortion between you and direct experience, and the more identified you are with the Archon, the thicker the veil becomes, until you're no longer living in the world, you're living in a projection of the world, filtered through a structure that was designed to keep you imprisoned in reaction. The prison isn't external, it's not society, it's not other people, it's the lens itself. And the lens is maintained by the patterns you continue to feed. But what happens when you stop feeding them? You didn't design the Archon, you inherited it, from your parents, from your culture, from the lineage of unprocessed trauma and unconscious repetition that stretches back generations. Every fear your mother never faced became a whisper in your nervous system. Every wound your father refused to feel became a tension in your body. Every belief your ancestors accepted without question became a default setting in your mind. This is not blame. This is structure. You were born into a field of patterning, and before you had language, before you had choice, those patterns began to shape you. They became the foundation of your identity, the scaffold of your personality, and because they were there from the beginning, you never thought to question them. They felt like you. But here's the mechanism. The Archon doesn't just transmit through ideas, it transmits through emotion, through the unspoken, through the way your caregivers responded to your needs, through the silences, through what was allowed and what was forbidden. Before you could think, you were learning what emotions were safe, what desires were acceptable, what parts of yourself needed to be hidden. And those lessons didn't come from conscious teaching. They came from attunement, from the energetic field around you, from the way love was given or withheld, and because you were dependent on that field for survival, you adapted, you shaped yourself to fit, you suppressed what threatened connection, you amplified what earned approval, and in that shaping the Archon took root. This is why self-improvement often fails. Because you're trying to change the surface while the root remains untouched. You're trying to think differently while the deeper patterning continues to run. You're trying to choose consciously while the unconscious structure overrides every choice. The Archon doesn't live in your thoughts, it lives beneath them, in the unexamined assumptions, in the reflexive reactions, in the emotional charge that appears before you have time to think. And until you meet it there at the level of the body and the nervous system, it will continue to operate. Invisible, persistent, mistaken for self. How deep does it go? There is a price for living unaware of the Archon, and the price is your life, not your biological life, but your lived life, the possibility of presence, of spontaneity, of seeing the world without the filter. Most people go from birth to death, never experiencing a single moment of unmediated reality. Every experience is interpreted, every sensation is labeled, every encounter is filtered through the past. They never see another person. They see their projection of that person. They never feel an emotion. They feel their story about the emotion. They never taste food. They taste the memory of food, the comparison, the judgment. The Archon keeps them in a hall of mirrors, where everything reflects back to the constructed self, and they mistake this for living. But the cost goes deeper, because unconsciousness isn't passive, it's generative. It produces suffering, not because suffering is inherent to existence, but because unconsciousness creates conflict. It creates resistance. It makes you fight against what is, in service of what the Archon thinks should be. And that fight is exhausting. It drains your energy. It keeps you in a state of low-grade tension, always trying to manage reality, always trying to control outcomes, always trying to avoid the feelings the Archon has labeled unacceptable. This is the loop. The Archon generates discomfort, then convinces you that something external needs to change for the discomfort to end. So you chase, you fix, you optimize, you rearrange the external world, hoping it will finally bring peace. But it never does, because the discomfort isn't coming from outside. It's being generated from within by the structure itself. And here's the trap. The more you chase, the more you reinforce the pattern. The more you try to escape discomfort, the more you feed the Archon's hold. Because the chase is the point. The seeking is the mechanism. The Archon doesn't want you to arrive. It wants you to keep moving, keep striving, keep identified with lack. Because a mind at rest is a mind that might notice. A heart at peace is a heart that might see through the veil. And the moment you see through it, the moment you recognize the pattern for what it is, the Archon loses its grip. But most never reach that moment. Most die still chasing, still identified, still believing the voice in their head was their own. What if there was another way to listen? The Archon doesn't just shape one lifetime. It repeats across lifetimes, not because of supernatural mechanics, but because patterns don't resolve themselves. They loop. An unresolved wound becomes a core belief. A core belief becomes a behavioral pattern. A behavioral pattern becomes a life trajectory. And that trajectory, if followed unconsciously, recreates the same conditions again and again. The specifics change, the names change, the settings change, but the essence remains. the same relational dynamic, the same emotional struggle, the same failure to see. This is what the Gnostics meant by the cycle of return, not reincarnation in the literal sense, but the recursive nature of unconsciousness, the way it pulls you back into the same patterns until you finally stop and face them. You've seen this in your own life, the way certain themes repeat, the way you swore you'd never recreate your parents' mistakes and then found yourself doing exactly that, the way you left a situation because it was toxic only to find the same toxicity in a new form, the way you tried to change, tried to grow, tried to become someone different, and yet the same core struggles persisted. This isn't failure. This is the Archon's design. It doesn't want resolution. It wants continuation. It wants you to keep circling, keep seeking, keep believing that the next external change will finally bring freedom. But freedom isn't found in the next relationship, the next job, the next belief system. Freedom is found in the recognition of the pattern itself, in the willingness to stop running and meet what has been chasing you all along. And what has been chasing you is not external. It's the unmet parts of yourself, the disowned emotions, the rejected sensations. The aspects of experience the Archon taught you were unacceptable. Those parts don't disappear. They accumulate. They press against the edges of your awareness, demanding to be seen. And when you refuse to see them, they manifest as compulsions, as projections, as the same situations recurring in your life, offering you the same opportunity to finally turn around and face what you've been avoiding. The cycle continues until you meet it, until you stop identifying with the voice that tells you to keep running, and instead become the awareness that can hold it all. But most people don't stop. Most people die mid-loop, still believing the next turn will be different. What if you're already in the loop right now? There comes a moment in every life when the structure begins to crack, when the repetition becomes so obvious you can't ignore it anymore, when the voice in your head says the same thing for the 10,000th time, and suddenly you hear it as separate, as other. This moment is disorienting, because if that voice isn't you, then what are you? The Archon fights hardest at this edge. It intensifies the thoughts. It floods you with emotion. It pulls out every fear, every doubt, every piece of evidence that you need to stay identified. Because the Archon knows that if you take one step back, if you rest in the awareness that observes the thoughts instead of believing them, it loses its hold. And it will do everything to prevent that step. This is why awakening isn't peaceful at first. It's destabilizing, because the structure you've built your entire life around is revealed to be hollow. The identity you defended was never real. The beliefs you clung to were inherited, not chosen. The fears you obeyed were conditioned, not true. And in that revelation there is grief, a profound grief for the time lost, for the years spent serving a pattern that was never yours. But beneath the grief, if you stay present, there is something else, a silence, a spaciousness, a sense of being that doesn't depend on thought. This is what the Gnostics called the true self, not a new identity, not a better version of the ego, but the awareness that was always there, beneath the noise, waiting to be recognized. But here's the challenge. The Archon doesn't disappear just because you see it. The pattern doesn't dissolve just because you recognize it. It persists, it pulls, it tries to reassert itself, and this is where most people fall back. They touch the silence, then get scared and retreat into the familiar, back into the loop, back into identification. Because the Archon offers something the silence doesn't. It offers certainty. It offers a known self. It offers the comfort of the cage. And for most, the comfort of the cage is stronger than the call of freedom. So they return. And the cycle continues. Unless you stay. Unless you meet the discomfort. Unless you learn to rest in the awareness that doesn't need to be someone. Can you? The Archon is not your enemy. It's a structure, a mechanism, a pattern that arose in the absence of awareness and now continues because it's been fed for so long. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't want to harm you. It simply wants to persist. And it persists through your identification, through your belief that the voice is yours, through your refusal to question the origin of your thoughts. But the moment you question, the moment you step back and observe, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, A crack appears, a space opens, and in that space, there is a possibility that wasn't there before. The possibility of seeing without the filter, of feeling without the story, of being without the need to become. This isn't about transcendence. It's not about escaping the body or rejecting the world. It's about presence, about meeting what is as it is without the overlay of the past. The Archon thrives in distraction, in avoidance, in the constant movement away from the present moment, but it dissolves in stillness, in the direct encounter with what you've been running from, in the willingness to feel what you've been taught not to feel. This doesn't mean the patterns disappear overnight. It means you stop serving them, you stop feeding them your attention, you stop believing the voice that tells you who you are and what you need, and slowly the structure loosens, the loop slows, the grip softens, and what remains is simple. Awareness, not as a concept, not as a goal, but as what you already are beneath the layers, beneath the conditioning, beneath the inherited fears and unquestioned beliefs. The Gnostics didn't teach a way out of the world, they taught a way to see through it, to recognize the structure, and in recognizing it, to no longer be bound by it, not because you fought it, not because you transcended it, but because you stopped identifying with it. And in that stopping, you remembered something you had always known but had forgotten, that you are not the voice. You are the listening. The question is not whether you can escape the Archon. The question is whether you can hear the difference.